Okay, so 10.7 introduces complex numbers. So within complex numbers is basically a number of the form a plus bi. So a is considered a real part, a real number. I is considered imaginary. So when we first did radicals, if we try to take the square root of something negative, we were told that it's not a real number. And so what we want to do is we want to understand what's going on there. How do you create a -4? So to take the square root of a -4 is saying that there is some value that we can raise to the second power and get a -4, right? So is there something we can square or raise to the second power and create a -4? So when we think about it, if you raise 2 to the second power, what do you get? +4. If you raise -2 to the second power, what do you get? +4. And so how is it possible to create a -4? Well, it's not possible to create a -4 from squaring anything on the real number line, which is why complex numbers and the imaginary number is introduced. So the imaginary I is defined as the square root of a -1. So by us saying what is the square root of -4, here's what we're doing. We're really saying the square root of -1 times a 4. So what does that mean? Well, using the definition of radicals, it means square root of -1 times the square root of 4. Okay, so what do we know? We know that we were just introduced to the imaginary number I. So anytime you see a negative under a square root, it is automatically introducing I. So here, the square root of -1 is I. The square root of 4 is 2. So the answer is 2I. You should always write it like we write all terms. The coefficient, numerical coefficient, should be in front. The variable component should be second. Okay, so we're just pulling it out. So let's look at another one. The square root of -81. So I broke it down for you, but you don't need to break it down. As soon as you see the square root of a negative, your mind can automatically say, all right, so that means an I. So I comes out, which gets rid of the negative automatically. So I'm left with I square root of 81 under the radical. So under the radical is just the square root of 81. Well, what is the square root of 81? 9. Problem solved. Or simplified, basically. So square root of -12. So first I'm going to bring out my I to get rid of that negative under the square root. And then I'm going to break down my 12. So I get 2I times the square root of 3. So you break down your radicals as you always would, except when you see the square root has a negative under it, you should automatically pull out the I and then break down your radical accordingly. So let's see, what if we have the square root of -6? So the I would come out, and then we would be left with square root of 6 under the radical. Doesn't simplify anymore. Problem is done. Okay, so that's how you're using your imaginary I. So then we want to simplify using I. So let's look at this. So we're simplifying complex numbers. So we're adding, subtracting, multiplying. You're going to treat the I just as you would if it was an X, an A, whatever. So I'm going to get rid of my parentheses by what? Distributing invisible ones. And then I'm going to combine like terms. 16. And then -9 plus 5, -4I. Done. That's it. You treat the I like you would if it was an A, a B, a C, whatever kind of variable. So let's see if we had 3 plus 2I minus 6 minus 4I. So we would have 3 plus 2I. This I would have to distribute the negative, so I would get a negative 6 plus 4i, and then I would combine like terms. So negative 3 plus 6i. Problem simplified. Okay, let's see. 4i minus 3 plus I. So 4i minus 3 plus I. So again, there's a negative 1 out here. So 4i minus 3 minus I or 1i. It's up to you. So 4i minus 1i is a 3i. So negative 3 plus 3i. So we're writing it in a plus bi form. Your directions will tell you a plus bi form. That means the real part goes first, and then the imaginary part, whatever's connected to the I, should be second. So that's how we add and subtract. Then we want to multiply. Multiplying is where we get a new rule. So what do we know? We know I is defined as the square root of negative 1. I squared is defined as negative 1. This is a big rule here. Anytime you see I squared that is not considered simplified, I squared must always be rewritten as negative 1. I squared must always be written as negative 1. So let's look at a problem. Again, our process of multiplying is not different from if we had x's and y's. We would just distribute and do all of the same things we've done since beginning algebra. We will just simplify differently when we get to the very end. So 12i plus 6i squared. So this cannot be a final answer because I squared is not considered simplified. So 12i plus 6 times negative 1, because I squared is really a negative 1. So then that gives me negative 6 plus 12i. So I just rewrote it in the correct a plus bi form. So I put the real part in front and the imaginary part second. So that's it. That's how we multiply. So negative 3i times 3i minus 9. My Apple Pencil is going to die soon, so I'm just going to hurry up. So I multiply, I distribute, so negative 9i squared plus 27i. So I squared is really what? A negative 1. So 9 plus 27i. Done. So this one I put in parentheses, this one I just put the dot times negative 1. You have to understand both ways, whatever works for you. It's just a basic multiplication. So here, what do? It's a FOIL or a distribute, right? So 25 minus 15i plus 15i minus 9i squared. So 25, 15, and 15, those cancel each other out, minus 9i squared. So I squared is really negative 1. So I'm looking at 25 plus 9, which would give us a final answer of 34. And we're done. So when we're multiplying, we multiply like we always multiplied, except now, anytime we have I squared, we should replace it with negative 1. So here, 9 minus 8i squared. Well, we should know what that means. 9 minus 8i times 9 minus 8i. Remember, you must write it twice. No shortcut. So then we distribute through 81 minus 72i, negative 72i, plus 64i squared. I just distributed everything through 81. These are same signs, so I'm just going to add those numbers together. So negative 144i plus 64 times negative 1, because I see I squared. You should never write I squared more than one time. Once you write it once, the next line, it should always be replaced as a negative 1. Minus 64. So 81 minus 64 will combine. So 17 So 17 minus 144i, and I'm done. Problem is finished. Okay? So that's your operations with complex numbers. So that's your I simplifying the square root of a negative and then simplifying complex numbers that contain